Hello, my American Studies 140 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins coming to you for weeks 13 and 14 of the full-length course and week 6 of the summer to 2020 X course for DC Life Inside the Monument. This particular lecture is probably the last set of lectures I will be filming for the course in all of this in terms of, lecture summaries. And the topics are around LGBT life, LGBTQIA life in Washington, D.C. and DMV and how that's evolved over the years in terms of both living as LGBTQIA in Washington, D.C. and as well as dealing with the fact of fighting for LGBTQIA rights from a national perspective or from a local perspective or both in DC. So that would be normally a week 13 issue to cover unto itself. Week 14, which is usually the last lecture I do for this course, talks about the modern day protest culture in DC, and with that as a backdrop, the women's march that happens the day after the inauguration of President, in this case Trump, in 2017, and how that's evolved in our last couple of years. so really, at this point, if you're in the summer course, you're finishing up your project proposals and you have a final reflection due at the end of week 6. If you are in the regular full-length course, you are finishing up the second drafts of your project, basically your executive summary for the project you've been working on, or the paper you worked on, or the presentation you're working on, or some combination of out of the three of those. You usually aren't writing a paper and putting together a formal presentation at the same time, and writing a presentation executive summary all at the same time. It's either going to be a summary of your presentation, or executive summary for your presentation and the presentation materials themselves, or it's going to be a paper with a presentation, as the case may be. So that's for the fall or spring version of this course. So anyway, that's where we generally would be. So the themes around the last 2 weeks, of the course, as well as for really weeks 11 on, are about putting more of a cosmopolitan, international, metropolitan face to what is DC. Most of the course is dedicated to DC's history and its evolution, basically from a southern town to the seat of power for the world's most powerful nation, seat of power for the U.S., and slash a place that's still colloquial, provincial, very southern, very literally black and white in terms of race, class, and gender-related issues around the issue of being south of the Mason-Dixon line, being black and being being white at the same time. So this part of this covers folks who are not heterosexual, who are queer in some way, shape, or form, right? And DC is known as basically being this mecca for LGBT life, a place where there's supposedly the most gay place in the United States. I think Chelsea and the East Village of New York would beg to differ, to be perfectly honest with you. If you've been around Washington Square, which is right next to NYU, if you've been in the Village, if you've been in Chelsea, it seems like there's a lot of stuff going on for the queer community in New York there. All right, just as one place, right? We can talk about the Mission District in San Francisco with a lot of change because of gentrification there. But truthfully, there are other places that could easily compete with DC in terms of being the gayest place, if you will. And I'm putting that in air quotes. You can't see me doing it, so maybe you can see now I'm doing the air quotes in terms of this as being the gayest place. But the truth is, if you look at the history of DC with regarding to LGBT rights, with regard to the life of someone who is LGBTQIA living in DC, it's pretty much the same as anywhere else in America. High levels of homophobia and intolerance, expecting people to keep that part of their lives under, under wraps, in the closet, if you will, and so on and so forth. Of course, there have always been people who were queer living in D.C. It's rumored that at least one president, James Buchanan, was a confirmed bachelor, meaning that he was gay and that he had gay lovers even while he was president of the United States. And it, you know, and being under that pressure while also being a segregationist and a protector of slave states and all that means that just because someone's gay does not mean they're progressive, for that matter. And he was probably one of the worst presidents we ever had. His gay lifestyle has nothing to do with it, but it just points out the fact that being gay does not mean that you're progressive either. It just means that you recognize the fact that you are not heterosexual. That's all it really means. So, but I bring that up to say that there's a history of folks who are gay, who are lesbian, who are transgender, who are transvestites, for that matter, who are queer and inquiring and asexual and bisexual, right? Living in this city, just like anywhere else in the world, anywhere else in human history. But it's not very well recorded. There isn't a lot on um, sexual orientation in the history of Washington, D.C. You have to find articles on it. They're few and far in between. There's not enough research done on it, and so on and so forth. So there's that. So if you really want to understand the history of D.C. regarding LGBT life and culture within D.C., you really are going back to the 1940s and 50s. Really, it's the first period where there's any significant amount of recording from the historical community and from the journalism world around the fact that there are folks who are not, heterosexual living in D.C. And it's really around something known as the Lavender Scandal, or the Lavender Scare, for that, which is what it's really called. There's actually a film on this that I do not have access to called The Lavender Scare, and it's called the Lavender Scare because lavender is supposedly the color of folks who are queer, right? It's not called the Pink Scare; it's called the Lavender Scare, purple, if you will, and it's tangential to the Red Scare, which is this period in American history in which Congress and HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and Joe McCarthy and all these other folks are going after Americans because they might have had an affiliation with the Communist Party USA, they might have been affiliated with the Socialist Party USA, they might have one point in time supported the USSR, they might have, in fact, have said some things to the effect that communism isn't bad, those kinds of things, going after folks because they supposedly were communists. Now, this thing went way beyond just people who are card-carrying members of CPUSA or the Socialist Party USA. It went on to include anybody who had any radical thought about anything. So if you were a civil rights activist, you were considered a commie. If you were an activist for women's rights, you were considered a commie. If you wanted Puerto Rican statehood or Puerto Rican independence, which, by the way, was an issue in the 1950s to the point where the Capitol building was actually attacked by Puerto Rican nationalists, then you were considered a communist as well. And of course, if you happen to be gay, if you happen to be lesbian, if you happen to be transgender, if you happen to be bisexual, you were also considered an enemy of the state in this period too. And the Lavender Scandal involves that. Upwards of 5,000 federal employees lost their jobs in the 1950s and early 1960s as a result of the Lavender Scare. And since D.C. is the headquarters for a lot of federal programs, a lot of federal buildings, that then impacted the LGBT community, the burgeoning community that was in D.C. at that time. You combine that with more local things, which are typical of cities everywhere, where LGBT folks, particularly gay men, particularly white gay men, would find their way to bars along P Street, between 17th and 23rd and P Street, and what's now parts of DuPont Circle, in the area west of 16th Street and U, and parts of Shaw, actually, if you happen to be black and gay, right, hanging out. There would be police raids on these places, shutting them down, arresting people for lewdness and licentious activity, and so on and so forth. That was all part of what was happening during this time period as well. The Stonewall uprising in New York in 1969 is what kicks off the gay rights movement as an official movement in the United States. It happened to be led by a black transgender woman who happened to rise up and say, let's fight the police off. It didn't happen quite the same way in D.C., but certainly the idea of fighting for your rights as someone who's LGBT, as someone who's queer, was part and parcel of being an active member of the LGBTQIA community in DC and in the DMV. And in the 1970s, there were a couple of national marches, protests organized, including the national protest for lesbian and gay rights in DC on October 14, 1979. That's literally the first true national gay rights movement act of this kind of thing happening in DC in this period. It includes large swaths of what would have been the national leadership of LGBT rights organizations like excuse me, the Human Rights Coalition, for instance, what would eventually, an organization that would eventually become ACT UP in the 1980s, during the AIDS crisis, leaders from that. But it was still segregated. It got to the point where black LGBT folk were having their own separate meetings. They were invited, but they weren't centered in this gathering of 20,000 people in 1979. They were a small minority of a couple hundred people. Even though Audre Lorde, a prominent black lesbian poet, got to speak during this march, and if you look on YouTube under the class DC Life in the Monument, you'll see this video of her, talking about these issues around being inclusive even within the LGBT rights movement, and the need for inclusion of folks who are not just white, right, and within the movement as well. So there's that aspect to this. But then, there's also the whole, what really expands the notion of LGBT rights and what folks were fighting for, of course, was the AIDS crisis, the HIV/AIDS crisis that struck first and hardest with with LGBT folk in the 1980s and 1990s. And so, with the rise of ACT UP and other organizations, you begin to see a shift both on a national basis and within DC and how to deal with public health issues around HIV and AIDS, to deal with issues in terms of the rights of folks to visit, loved ones, of, bequeathing, of having living wills and bequeathing certain rights and responsibilities to partners whom they could not marry because it was illegal for people who were same sex to marry each other in the United States officially until 2012. In most states, pretty much through most of the 1990s. I think Hawaii was one exception up at this point, maybe the only exception, but most states didn't recognize this at this point. All of those things come to a fore, not only on a national basis, but in D.C. itself, with the federal government, basically officially protecting gay rights, but D.C. government at one point not doing the same thing. And then when D.C. government finally starts protecting some of those rights, they go further, ultimately, than what the federal government would normally go through. But there's still issues. There's still issues around how many, how far D.C. government versus the federal government can cover such rights. The Supreme Court literally just ruled in June that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also applies to folks who are LGBTQIA. So that's a victory in a sense, but it's a very limited victory because it's not like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 specifies, right, what happens if you do not protect the rights of LGBTQIA folks. Like, do you lose federal dollars if you're a public school that doesn't have stalls so that, transgender women and boys and girls and transgender men and women can use those stalls without fear of repercussions, those kinds of things. So it's all of those things about living in D.C., being LGBTQA in DC, and fighting for your rights in the nation's capital while also being a local resident, a local Washingtonian at the same time, that makes this a bit interesting. The film that you have to watch for week 6/week 13, depending on which semester you're in, called Check It, takes this to another level so that you can see the lives of folks who are working poor, working class, homeless, etc., but also black and gay, black and transgender, black and lesbian, black and bisexual, and see what they're dealing with in terms of how to live in the society that doesn't want them to be who they are, that doesn't want them to be be happy, who in fact will discriminate against you, will in fact try to kill you, right? Or rape you because of who you are. And so this film very vividly goes over these issues that face folks of color, particularly black folks who happen to be queer, the black queer community in DC. And so Check It gives you that sense of what's really out there, what's really happening for folks who are not heterosexual living in DC, and the fact that these folks, this queer community, this mini community within the larger LGBTQIA community in DC, are facing on a day-to-day basis, and what it's taking them to overcome the discrimination, the oppression, the brutality that they face from the larger community, the larger Washingtonian community, black and white.